Welcome, everyone. Hello from ZP and the public office. Hello from Beirut. Welcome to all of our organizations, NGOs, social enterprises, and community centers dialing in from the ground from all over the Middle East. Today, I am delighted to be introducing our fourth training seminar from the ZP Public Office Knowledge Platform. Today, we are talking about empowering NGO storytelling, how to unleash that media impact. And I'm going to be introducing you to three friends very soon. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we have all of our logistics down, beginning with making sure that everyone is aware that you have interpretation that is live at your disposal. You just look down on your Zoom at the bottom of the bar. There is a globe, there is a world icon. Just click on that and choose the language that you would like to hear this seminar in. As well, for all of us dialing in, do take a quick moment to introduce yourselves on the chat room so that we know who is with us, your name, your organization, and where you are dialing in from, and anything else you would like to share with us on this sunny Beirut afternoon. And as well, before we get into this, as many of you who have been with us before know, we like to begin with a ritual of asking you questions first before we dive in. So I am going to go ahead and launch a poll and invite everyone to just take a quick moment to answer 4 questions. Our first question for today is, what type of organization are you? Our second question is, where is your organization based? Our third question is, in what environment do you work? And our last fourth question is, are you a women's-led organization? You can also find the translation of the poll in Arabic on the chat. So once you've reviewed it in Arabic, just drop in your answers on the screen in English in front of you. We'll give everyone a quick minute, and then I'm so excited to be introducing you to our expert panelists for today. So 50% of us have already answered these 4 questions. Let's give us another +minute and let's take a look together at who is dialing in this afternoon. Over 60% answered. We'll close the poll in just 20 seconds. So I'll let everyone take a final quick read and answer. %70 through, almost 75% through. I'm about to close the poll. Let's take a look together at these answers. And for those of us who've answered on the chat, just switch over to the poll in front of you, your screen in front of you, and answer them into the poll directly. We're over 75% answered. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Let's take a look together. So over 75% of us dialing in today are a locally registered NGO. And over 80% are dialing in from Lebanon, and the rest are dialing in from Iraq and Syria. For those of you who put in other, Would you please share with us on the chat which country you are dialing in from? We'd love to hear from you. To answer our third question, in what environments do you work? Almost 20% of you are working in urban areas and over 20% in rural. But the majority, 60%, are working in a mix of areas. And last but not least, almost 70% of our organizations dialing in today are women-led. 20% are partially led by women. It's great to have all of you with us. So let me tell you how we will be structuring today. Our agenda is to talk about how we can strengthen NGO relationships with international media. And I will be presenting you with three incredible editors and bureau chiefs in just a moment. We'll be talking about how to build those relationships. And very importantly, how to communicate your stories, the tough stories and the success stories, and to make sure that we are doing so authentically. And very importantly, when we're talking with media, we have to recognize that as the organizations on the ground, we are the ones that are closest to the story. And so what is very important is to help our media stakeholders also get close to the on the ground story. And we're going to be talking about all of this today. So let me introduce you to our first guest speaker. We have here with us Abby Sewell, a dear friend of ZT. Abby is the Associated Press News Director for Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. She's been based in Lebanon since 2016, where she's also had multiple other positions as freelance and staff reporters and editors in multiple local and international news outlets. So welcome to Abby. Abby has produced and written a lot of very important features and deep dive analytical work on critical situations in multiple crises across the region. So definitely Google Abby and check out what she has recently written. It will teach you a lot about what do excellent practices in storytelling and writing and giving voice look and read like. We also have with us Mohammed Sheikh, who is the bilingual correspondent and Beirut bureau chief of Deutsche Welle. Mohammed is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker and a digital storytelling trainer, very specialized in investigations and current affairs in conflict, politics, and terrorism. And in fact, we had previously commissioned Mohammed to co-produce and direct for us the first Yazidi-led documentary based in Sinjar. So welcome back to Mohammed, who previously was also with the BBC and has worked in multiple capacities across the region, also working with NGOs and local NGOs on the ground. So welcome. And we have our third guest speaker, Maya Jberi, who is the Reuters bureau chief for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And Maya has produced a lot of, as well, award-winning, very interesting features. And I did forget to mention that Mohammed has a lot of very interesting publications on Google. Please Google Mohammed and Google Maya to read, for example, Maya's work in climate change, tech, socioeconomic, humanitarian crises, and really a lot of deep dive features on very difficult topics, such as the disappeared, such as international justice, and more. Prior to joining Reuters, Maya was working with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and the Agence Press all around the region as well, holding also freelancing roles previously. So friends, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us. And it means so much to all of us that you've taken the time to be with us. And I want to share with everyone how I reached out to Maya, Abby, and Muhammad. And I told them, I said, friends, we're trying to make sure that we are giving the highest quality training and the highest quality content in English and in Arabic to our friends in the ecosystem, NGOs that we support, and organizations that we really, really care about. And I asked them, what do you think? Would you be interested in joining us on this occasion? And within 2 minutes, every single one of them had come back to me to say, absolutely, Lynn, count us in. This is a really important webinar for us to be at, and we would love to get to support local organizations on the ground. So a huge thank you to all of you for taking your time off of a very busy and a very typical news cycle schedule these days. So thank you immensely. We are going to begin with a series of questions that we have prepared for our three panelists today. For any of us who have any other questions that we'd also like to have asked and discussed, please do not hesitate to just drop your question in on the Q&A. The Q&A is also located at the bottom of your Zoom. So please feel free to ask your question in Arabic and or in English. And if you have any logistical challenges or need a little bit of help on Zoom, don't hesitate to reach out on the chat. My team is here to support you. And for those of us who just dialed in, we're now almost 70 local NGOs on the ground on this call. Please note that you do have interpretation readily available for you. So I'd like to begin with a kickoff question. We have over 50 NGOs on the ground from Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, who dialed in with us today. And some of us are still trying to dial in, but suffering from some internet issues. What strategic recommendations do you have for them on how to build meaningful relationships with the media to ensure that their stories are heard? Abby, can we kick off with you?
All right. Well, thanks so much for having us, Lynn. I think actually Lynn could be a great example for many of the people on this call in how you build successful relationships with the media, because she does a lot of the things that I would recommend. First of all, you want to build personal relationships with journalists who are working in the field in the areas that you're working in. So get to know the media landscape, follow journalists on social media who are covering the area that you work in, whose work you find interesting. Try to start a conversation with them. It could be initially on social media and then maybe over email, and then reach out and try to have coffee. But basically establish that personal relationship so it's a two-way street. So they'll come to you when they're working on something that is related to your topic of expertise. And when you send them a press release, they'll actually open it and read it. I think that's really the best advice I can give.
Thank you so much for that, Abby. And so in other words, it's not that difficult to make sure that we build those long-term and authentic relationships. Maya, could you tell us a little bit more from your perspective? What have you seen are very thoughtful practices when building meaningful stakeholder media relationships?
I think thanks, Lynn, again, and I apologize. I've lost a little bit of my voice, so I'm gonna try to speak, but this is much more. I sound much raspier than I usually sound. It's a really good question, and I think it's one that is very common for a lot of organizations in Lebanon and across the region who don't necessarily have the budget, let's say, to have a full-time media person or a full-time advocacy person. And so you've got a lot of people who are trying to do multiple things at once, and you've got somebody who is trying to be, on the side of their other full-time responsibilities for that organization, also be reaching out to media. So when talking to some of these organizations and trying to advise them on how to maximize coverage of their amazing initiatives that often go undercovered. The first step that I suggested they do always is to identify your goals, like anything in life. Figure out exactly what you want covered. Is it that you want your events covered? You want your reports covered? You want, some media some organizations to know what you're up to, but sometimes if you're doing sensitive work, you don't necessarily want all of your activities to be out in the public. So every organization is going to have a different set of needs and a different set of things that they want publicized versus not. And then from there, you can basically put journalists into different categories. So these are the journalists that I can invite to a press release, a press event, press conference, usually TV, because I know that they're going to want something for their daily news feed. They're going to need some kind of footage. They're going to need some kind of a statement. They need to be on the nightly news. So that's who I'm going to invite to the press conference. But I also know this really good investigative journalist who, if I give them some of my findings in my report ahead of time, they're going to go and do another kind of a bigger report on the same issue, and I will get even more coverage on that issue. So I think what I find these organizations tend to do, because they're short on time, they're short on staff, they're short on funds, they'll think, okay, how do I get more coverage? And they're not really thinking through what they mean when they say that. So my kind of core piece of advice would just be, take a deep breath, start at the beginning. What are you really trying to get coverage for? And from there, you can just map out the different journalists that would be right for you to do each of those types of coverage.
That's very, very practical advice, Maya. I can really visualize a table with the key themes or areas of interest or areas of communication and focus, and then identifying, who are researchers and journalists that you look up to, that you believe speak your language, share your values. And usually people who share common values would really welcome a reach out, a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, a very friendly discussion. Many journalists are actually readily available and want to make themselves available when they are in this space of giving voice to communities and giving voice to causes. Thanks a lot for that. And to top this all up, Mohammed, talk to us a bit about any further advice that you would recommend our organization diving in today.
Yeah, I would say that, thank you for having us first. And I would say that really the colleagues covered it all. I would probably only add that NGOs should have a smart approach when coming to media outlets and journalists, and think of their topics and their stories as, what are they offering to these journalists, rather than coming up with the idea that we want these media outlets to serve as propaganda tools for us, which they won't do. I mean, if you come with the topic, an idea, a protagonist, the problem and its solution, there's definitely a story that journalists would be interested in working on. So yeah, just come up with a full approach and smartly talk to journalists on the topics that would actually lead to shed light on your work as an NGO, rather than just come up with what you do and this is what I want, and please come just do some video or photo or some text on our work.
Thanks so much for that, Mohammed. And actually, I want to build upon what you've just said, because I believe that one of the things that I find always very interesting and helpful is to ask journalists that I look up to and whose writing has inspired me. I ask them, what do you care about? And what type of stories and coverage do you like to be a part of? And what are the most effective ways of bringing you on board or inviting you on the ground? What I love to do is invite journalists to teach me how to work with them. I recognize that journalists have very little time on their hands, and they have a lot of competing editorial requirements, different stories that they are hearing about, and it is very hard to say no. But it's even harder to say yes, because there are just so many priorities. And so asking journalists that we look up to and who inspire us to invite them to guide us on how to work with them is always a very wonderful sign of respect and a great starting point for collaboration. And so speaking about sharing and telling stories, I'd like to shift to our next question. You know, we are working in an increasingly competitive media environment where editors are constantly dealing with breaking news, where journalists are back-to-back on deadlines and long hours and definitely burning the midnight oil. And our readers have tighter and shorter attention spans. And so in this difficult environment where it's difficult for our media stakeholders, and needless to say, it is of course very difficult for our NGOs and community organizations working on the ground, how can we make it easier? How can NGOs make their success stories newsworthy and compelling? And as bureau chiefs and news directors, I know that you are doing so much work amplifying on the ground stories, but what storytelling techniques have you found to be especially captivating? Could you share with us a couple of examples today? Maya, over to you to kick us off.
I like that. You're keeping us on our toes, switching up the order. Okay, so I think the first piece of advice that I would give is you have to read the news. I think for you to understand what the person, for you to want to be in the news, you have to understand what that product actually looks like. So it really helps when I'm talking to somebody from an organization that is, has been keeping up to date with the latest stories on that subject, not just the latest developments, let's say if you're an organization that works on refugees, not just the latest developments in terms of, the Lebanese government's policy on returns or the latest kind of aid developments. But if you're somebody also who is reading what organizations are writing about those issues, I think it will give you such a better layout of the land, because then you can say, actually, everyone's talking about this, but no one is talking about this. So if I take that to a really good journalist, then we can do a really good story together about this subject that my organization has a lot of expertise in. So definitely read so that what's out there, because you might also find that, okay, there's been like every publication in Lebanon has written about this issue. If I take this to a journalist, I'm really probably not going to find much interest. It's already been written about so much. So I think the first thing to make sure that you can tell a compelling and unique story is to know what's already out there. And I think that the other bit of advice that I would give, that I've found sometimes being approached as a journalist, sometimes I find that it can be unhelpful if the organization has already done all of the storytelling for me. I like to also discover the story. I like to figure out what might be the most interesting. Maybe I'm being too precious about what I want the perfect amount of information, but not too much. But I think in a lot of scenarios, it really works best if a journalist has access to as many ideas, dynamics, spokespeople, information, reports as possible, and they can use their expertise to decide what's going to have the biggest splash when they actually write the story.
That is so important, Maya. And I think what's coming out, what I'm hearing so far from the three of you is, there are very practical steps that we can be taking to ingrain authentic and very effective media practices within our organizations. And so, making sure that we are, as organizations, not getting siloed, not finding ourselves just focusing on what is at the tip of our noses. Stay connected and be part of the pulse, not just an observer of the pulse and the dynamics around us. Mohammed, what do you think, and what has been your experience in terms of storytelling techniques that you have found to be particularly attractive? Do you have a couple of examples that you could share with us today?
Yeah, I really think that there's, I mean, I don't think that there's one secret recipe for a successful storytelling or success story, but there are some elements and a set of best practices that would boost our story, that makes our story perform better. And especially online, because it's much more easy to measure. And I would say, I mean, what I call the set of best practices could be summarized into the 5 T's, what I call the 5 T's. And that would make the topic, the title, the treatment, the thumbnail, and tagging at the end. So I mean, I'm assuming that the NGOs have a comms department. They need to understand how to use a story. They have the incredible access to case studies, to protagonists, and that's what the journalists need, right? But in order to, I mean, the access alone is not going to make a great story, but all these elements combined together, as they understand how to speak the digital language and use the platform, choosing the right medium, the right platform, approaching the right journalists after they understand the news agenda or the current affair. So I mean, we definitely don't have enough time now to explain each and every element of the 5 T's, but these are mainly the best practices that would boost a story or make it perform better.
That's very helpful. And Mohammed, what you're telling us is also this workshop needs to become a series of webinars. We will definitely look into that and offer some more deep dive practices and development opportunities for our organizations with us today. Abby, you know, as a news director for different countries in the region, can you tell us and give us examples of storytelling techniques that you have found to be particularly effective?
Well, I guess first of all, I wanted to mention that I think you want to also look when you're pitching at, are you targeting local media? Are you targeting international media? Are you targeting print or are you targeting video? Because for instance, at the AP, we have a print team and we have a video team. And a lot of the local kind of initiatives that probably a lot of the people on this call would be looking to get coverage of, we most likely wouldn't cover on the print side because it's just too local. But our video operation, for instance, they do every week a series of local features in the Middle East. So if you're an organization who has an initiative that's interesting in Lebanon, but might not really have an international angle, you might want to try to approach the video team rather than the text team, for instance. So that's just one point. In terms of storytelling, I would say, I think that the most successful organizations, when they try to tell their stories to the media, they come prepared to connect journalists with specific cases, because journalists are always interested in the human angle, but also try to have data, try to have hard facts, because especially for the international media, really what we want is to have a human case, but also for it to have a larger kind of resonance. So we can say this is a specific case, but this is an example of a much larger trend.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much for that, Abby. And I'm starting to see some questions coming through to me on DM and also on the chat. I'm just going to invite anybody who has a question to start to post your questions on the Q&A. The Q&A is separate to the chat, and it is available at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And we will begin to take questions in just a bit. I have 4 more questions for our friends dialing in today. And I'd like to, however, take a quick moment and pause to invite everyone to respond to another poll. So I'm going to launch a poll just now. We have 3 questions, and the Arabic equivalent is on the chat for you. Our first question is, do you think your NGO's communications is effective? The second question is, how often do you use storytelling to share your experiences? And 3, how often do you interact with the media? So we are going to take a quick moment for everyone who's dialed in to reflect on how you operate as organizations, as teams. Let's hear from you. So we're 1/3 through. We'll give everyone a minute. Almost 50% through. So we'll give everyone a moment to just finish answering the questions on the screen, on the poll, and let's talk about your collective answers. And for those of us who've started a very interesting discussion on chat, please do continue to share comments, and we're doing our best to not only moderate this panel, but also answer your questions on the chat. So we're over 60% through, and I'm going to close the poll in just 20 seconds. Okay, so I am going to close the poll. We're just above 65%. And let's take a look at your collective responses. So, in answer to the first question, do you think your NGO's communications is effective? Only 16% of you have said very effective. The vast majority, over 40%, have said effective, and over 30% have said somewhat effective, and almost 10% have said not effective. I know that it is in these types of webinars where we're able to very safely look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, what are we doing? Are we doing it the way things need to be done? What can we do better? So thanks to everyone for your very honest responses. And your second question, how often do you use storytelling to share your experiences? 30% of you have said frequently, 45% have said when needed, but 20% have said rarely, and even 5% have said never. And those are very interesting insights. We're going to deep dive into this together. And the third question, how often do you interact with the media? Over 40% of you have said frequently. Over 30% have said when needed. Almost 20% have said rarely, and 7% have said never. So this is all very interesting. And I'd like to invite on the chat for whoever would like to talk about why you believe your communication strategy is effective. And if we could get some honest answers on the chat, why do you think it's somewhat or not effective? So anyone who would like to volunteer, we would love to hear from you on the chat, and I will be reading out some of your comments. We also would love to learn more about why are organizations not always interacting with the media, only when needed, rarely, or never? Tell us more about why it isn't, for example, a business as usual practice. If you could please drop that on the chat, that would be very insightful for all of us. And I'd like to actually take a look at the chat quickly before we continue with our panel questions. Mustafa, thanks for your very interesting comment. We rarely interact, although we do have nice stories, but we feel too humble to produce narratives to the press. We do not try to attract the media because we do not see the effectiveness of such narratives. Nabil Zaidan has said, I would like to share more of our experiences. Noor Hashim has said, I think it is a matter of how we measure impact as well. Nabil has told us, I would like to use storytelling more because it is attractive and it is motivating. And I'll read out one more from Rebecca Al-Asmar. It's hard to find the time to create posts, and it's hard to find them to create them in a creative way to attract an audience. We will continue to look in on the chat, so definitely keep those comments coming. But Abby, Maya, and Muhammad, you can see that there really is sometimes I feel a disconnect between the very hard work on the ground of our NGOs and our community organizations and you and your teams who are trying to get those stories out, but you have so many priorities and access is hard, time is precious, and we have so many competing interests. So my third question for you is the newsworthy cycle. What makes something worth publishing? What makes it worth the time of you and your editorial teams? That newsworthy cycle is often difficult for local ecosystems and communities to understand, especially from where they sit. They're on the ground. They're far away from the news desks, although they are in the news all the time. Today, what are examples of specific topics and causes that you and your teams are especially passionate about covering and reporting on? And how can today the local organizations on this call align some of their stories authentically with your editorial interests? Of course, noting that your editorial interests will continue to evolve, and that this is very much a timestamp on what is of interest today, and that might not be the case tomorrow or next week or next month. Mohammed, talk to us, kick us off here.
Well, first, let me say that we really often work under pressure and on very, very tight deadlines and schedules. So it feels like, I mean, NGOs, just like us, they need to be consistent because they shouldn't be frustrated just because their stories aren't picked up every single time they approach a media outlet. That's key. There should be some consistency. And I mean, as journalists, sometimes we pitch stories to the newsroom or to the editors, and it doesn't get picked up. So we need to be consistent about that and understand that this is the news business. There's a lot of priorities out there. Personally, human interest stories and evergreen topics are always nice and good. But personally, I mean, and that maybe tells a lot about being Lebanese. I'm more into at the moment corruption stories and mainly really interested in working with and collaborating with NGOs who work on data collection and publish open source data that we could use in our reporting and investigations on corruption topics, and just like use their data to connect the dots and present a clear narrative for the audience. Because sometimes, I mean, sometimes it's out there, but the audience, it's really, really hard. It's challenging for us as journalists to understand these data and do the analysis, etc. So we need these information and data to connect the dot and create one narrative that is easy for the audience to understand.
Thank you so much for that very practical advice. And so for those of us who are in the space of investigative, fact-checking, fact-finding topics, especially sensitive topics like corruption, do pay attention to some of the work that Mohammed has been publishing recently, and perhaps even feel free to reach out to Mohammed whenever you feel that you have something that you can, from an expertise perspective and a top access perspective, have a conversation with him. So Mohammed, thanks a lot for that. Abby, talk to us from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, and I think also for the AP perspective, there are some topics that are always interesting, and especially in this region. One of them is migration. Another one is energy and climate issues, then also human rights, economic justice. These are all pretty broad categories, but I think if you follow a lot of the international media coverage in the area, you'll find a lot of it falls into one of these. The difficulty is that these are also topics that have been covered a lot and are being covered a lot. So the challenge is always to find something new. So whether that's a story that has a really compelling character or a very unique angle, or there's a new trend or something, basically for it to be news, there has to be something new. So within these general topics, we're generally interested in stories, but the stories themselves have to offer something new to the audience.
Absolutely. And so when we say something new, I just want to ask a quick follow-up on this, Abby. What constitutes new? Because, for many of us who are dialing in, those of us who are such experts in our fields don't even sometimes notice that what they take for granted might actually be new to you. So how do we build in that awareness, and how do we present something that we might have known for a very long time, but the general public and maybe even the media doesn't?
Yeah, well, I think since you are all experts and you're working in the field and you're working on the ground, one thing is to look at what are the things that I am seeing repeatedly when I'm in the field or when I'm working with people, but I'm not seeing it covered in the media. If there are certain topics that you question, why is the media not covering this? Maybe it's because they just don't know. Maybe it's something that seems very obvious to you, but for the layperson or a journalist, it's not obvious. So I would say look at what you feel are the gaps in the coverage, and then think about to what extent that might be because people are just not aware that the story is there.
That's extremely helpful. And so for those of us in the displacement space, working with refugees, working with populations that are being redisplaced, working on issues of social justice, definitely take a look at some of the writings and publications that Abby has been featuring over the many years. In fact, that's how I met Abby. We met over Twitter because she had been writing on important social justice issues. So definitely take a look at that. And if you have something that you believe could be very noteworthy, definitely make it a point to reach out to Abby and talk to her and her team about what stories or insights or unique data and perspectives you might be able to bring to the table. And Maya, you have also a very wide range of areas of interest and areas of focus, but talk to us about what today you and your team are especially passionate about.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, like Abby said, we're chasing a lot of similar themes. We try to brainstorm as a team to come up with different ideas or variations on the theme that that could help us stand out. And what's really nice is that everybody, when we have these meetings, everybody will come in and say, I heard people talking about this, and it seems like people are asking a lot of questions about, let's say, if something is happening in Lebanon related to Saidafa, it'll be about Saidafa, and if people are thinking a lot about the heat, it'll be about the heat. So what's nice is that it's very much in our brainstorming sessions, it's very much fed by what people are talking about on that particular day. And so when you're thinking how you want to get into, how you want to, wheedle your way into the news cycle, think about what everyone's talking about. Think about kind of the hot topic of the day or of the week. And that's why I'm insisting, make sure that you're reading the news and that you know what's being talked about on the subjects. I will give one other tip as well that somebody did today, actually, and it made me really appreciate them, is if some of you are following, this kind of, there are these negotiations between Russia and the UN and Turkey and Ukraine about getting grain out of Ukraine, out of Black Sea ports, to be able to make it to the rest of the world. This feels like something that's really, really, really far away and really distant, but in fact, because our region imports so much wheat and so much grain from Ukraine, this will have a direct impact on us if this wheat and grain doesn't make it to the region. Even more so, the World Food Program, which provides food support and food supplements to a lot of families in the region, especially refugee families in Lebanon, Syria, displaced families, Jordan, etc. They buy a lot of their grain from Ukraine. So I heard about this deal not happening yesterday. I was thinking, maybe should we do a story about Lebanon and grain prices going up? We already kind of did that. And is it going to be really boring? I woke up this morning and I had an email in my inbox from an NGO that said, we distribute grain that is purchased on behalf of the world, by the World Food Program on our behalf. And there's a story there to be done about what this means if international aid organizations cannot get access to this grain. And it was the initiative that a different organization took to link a major international kind of global politics and food security story with something very, very, very local. Sometimes we think so often about the same stories that our brains just kind of get tired of coming up with a new idea because we feel like we're just telling the same story again and again. So what I really appreciated about this NGO was that they kind of did that work for me, and they basically linked this big news event. I was trying to think of some angle that we could cover with this big news event. They made that link for me, this big news event, vulnerable communities, people who are already at risk will be increasingly at risk because of these international developments. So I think one thing that organizations can do often is be that bridge. If you can be that bridge between major global developments and the impact that it has on the ground, especially for communities that are already vulnerable, I think that's a really important link that you can make, and that can really, you are riding the wave of the news cycle, but you're giving it a fresh edge.
So Maya, that's very valuable. And, you said something very important, which is, be part of the analysis and make sure that when we are talking about stories and we're talking about issues, that we are being analytical. We're not just being descriptive in our reporting, because the deep relevance that would matter for your readers is about that bridge, as you've said. And Maya has published, and her team have published, a lot of pieces that bring that analysis home and take these international issues and regionalize them and localize them. Because just because something is happening very far away doesn't mean that it isn't affecting us. Often stories aren't just about what is happening within our worlds, but Lebanon and all other countries dialing in today remain part of that bigger global picture. So definitely take a look at Maya's stories. And for those of us who are interested in reaching out to Maya, definitely please do so. I am mindful of the time. I don't know where the time is going. We just have 10 minutes left to close off. I'm going to ask our NGOs and organizations dialing in today to just make sure you're posting your Q&A, your questions, in the Q&A chat. It's different to the webinar chat. It's on the Zoom panel at the bottom of your Zoom. I am going to ask 2 more questions and then switch right into the questions that have already come through. Impact, and someone said this on the chat, importantly, impact has become a buzzword. And local NGOs have the hard job of selling impact and prospective impact. Could you share with us a memorable example, one example of effective impact storytelling that really marked you when you have been on the ground investigating and looking at stories? Abby, let's begin with you, please.
Okay, well, I think most of us probably got into journalism at some point because we wanted to make an impact, and a lot of us had lofty ideas that we're going to, we're going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein. I don't know if that's going to be a familiar reference for this audience, but we're going to take down a president, or we're going to completely change some sort of policy that's unjust. It's pretty rare in real life that actually happens. I would say probably 90% of the time when we're telling these human stories, the main impact is just that people feel heard, which in itself, I think, can be a valuable thing. But I would say one recent example that I can think of, and it was really a collective thing because there were a lot of different media outlets that were covering this, but the mass deportations of refugees in Lebanon a couple of months back. I mean, I worked on a story on this. I know I think Maya did as well. There was a lot of international and local media coverage of it that spoke directly to the people who were impacted. And I think that this had a big part in the final result, which was that there was pressure on the Lebanese government to stop this. And basically the practice, if not stopped, at least was rolled back.
Right, absolutely. And a very strong social justice lens to that as well. And Mohammed, in a couple quick words, impact storytelling, what is an example that really comes to your mind that you've seen or you got a chance to be a part of over the years?
Well, I would definitely say the documentary that I did on the tainted fuel and corruption in Lebanon, and it ended up like one of the companies that had so much power. It was so obvious how much they were involved in the scandal, but they had so much power that they could escape and bypass the judicial system. But it ended up by the company and the owners got sanctions by the US, and they're unable to operate in Lebanon and in Dubai so far.
That's a great example of the role that journalists play in affecting policy, affecting diplomacy, and affecting positive change. Thanks for that, Mohammed. And Maya, in a couple quick words, what is one impact story that is really memorable for you?
Yeah, the one, I don't know if you guys can hear me. The one that I can think of is from last year, actually, and it brings together a lot of the elements that we've talked about in this gathering. I spoke to a friend of mine who is a lawyer and who was working on a case for, if you remember, Lilian Shaito. Lilian Shaito was a woman who was left in the hospital since the day of the explosion, August 4th, 2020. She was completely paralyzed. She couldn't move. And he was actually working with her family to try to get her deposits out of the bank so they could pay for her hospital care. And so I was talking to my friend, and he was saying, it's unbelievable. She embodies so much of Lebanon's crises. And I was like, God, you're right. It's the explosion, it's the banking sector, it's the hospitals being in such bad conditions. So we ended up doing a story about her. So here we already have two elements. You have somebody who's kind of playing the role of interlocutor. He was able to make that connection in my head, where he was, just in the course of a conversation, he was saying, she's such a, it's such a miserable case for me to work on because she's disadvantaged for all of these reasons because of Lebanon's multiple crises. And the fact that the anniversary of the Beirut blast was coming up, and we were looking for some kind of a story to be able to represent, what Lebanon was going through at that time. So already we had these two elements to make a powerful story. We ended up working very closely with her sisters to make them comfortable. It was really very important for us to make them comfortable, to make her comfortable. And when we ended up getting permission from the hospital to film her, we did it on a phone because we didn't want her to see this big camera, and she hadn't really been interacting with that many people at this time. She couldn't vocalize or verbalize anything. So all of these different elements came together to create a powerful story. The visual element was extraordinarily important. So when you are working with a journalist, think about how important it is. What can they film? Everybody will ask you, what can we film? Who's going to go on camera? Are any of these victims of this abuse or of this violation going to be able to speak to me on the camera? And that's unfortunately, the top demand, I would say, from editors these days is to be able to have a visual element to a story. So all these things came together, and we were really surprised by the public, uptake of this story. Local Lebanese outlets picked it up. It was all over Twitter. And the family then started a fundraising campaign to try to fundraise support for her to be able to move out of AUB, out of the hospital AUB, and to get treatment in Turkey. They ended up making, they ended up getting to their targets. They moved to Turkey. She's getting treatment in Turkey, and I get these videos regularly of, the fact that she can move her hand like this, she can feed herself, she can start to move around. This is like the golden ticket for a journalist. It is the most meaningful thing that you could possibly do. And it's 1 in a million when it works out, but it's worth it.
That the magic of humanization. And in fact, your story had a lot to do with supporting the fundraising that ended up coming around, really rallying a lot of people with funds, with access to doctors, with access to immigration. And I remember that very, very well. And so, we have more questions for our friends here today. I'm going to pause on the questions that I still had and take a look at the Q&A. I know that some of our questions have already been answered. I know we just have a couple more minutes before closing. And so I'm going to just read out a couple of questions, and the rest we will quickly discuss. From Noor Hashim, coming from an academic research background, working on social issues, I thought journalists prefer to have the most powerful findings, important and shocking, and maybe also have access to qualitative data. From my experience, I do not think they have the time to read policy reports. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I know that Abby, you already touched upon this on the chat. Is there any advice or any perspective for Noor and others? I mean, do journalists have time? Do you have time to do your homework? In other words, do you have time to do that background check, to learn about how to think about topics and issues, to look at any publicly available information on those issues? Maya, I saw your hand go up. Go for it.
I mean, we do, but I think we're more selective about them at this point. I think we try to pick the things that we suspect or that we feel will lead to a good story. And what really helps is when a report has an executive summary that is very bullet points. And I know I feel like I'm coming off as like such a brat to this audience, but really I think that really helps us get to the core essence of as Lynn, as you said, the so what. Why do we care about this research? Does it have could it have implications for somebody on the ground? I remember got a report from NRC back when I was working in Iraq about statelessness and families who were accused of being affiliated to ISIS. And the typical stories that had been done so far up until then were about children not being able to go to school because they didn't have the right paperwork to register in school, even in schools in the camps that they were left in. But there was one little paragraph in it that was about healthcare. And it was about the fact that families were unable to be let into hospitals to have access to the national social security system, or to cross checkpoints if there were checkpoints between the camp that they lived in and the hospitals, and that was barring them from healthcare. So I ended up, I was reading this report, I saw that one paragraph, and I was like, that's the story. Everyone's written about education. The story is about lack of access to healthcare. So I ended up doing a full story about that because I was reading the document. So we know we can get great stories, but if we have access to something that is punchy, short, sweet, well structured and well summarized, that's our best shot.
That's very, very helpful. So when we're thinking about our media toolkits, our press toolkits, making the most important information very easy to find so that it doesn't take reading through a 20 or 30-page report, but the key elements that are going to activate and galvanize journalists to join you, making sure that that is highlighted clearly up front. Thanks for that, Maya. Tima had a very interesting question, and I'd like to begin to answer that and invite others on the chat to please help answer Tima's question. Could you please present us with a published real-life example of a story from a local NGO? This would help us understand how they effectively communicate their work and engage their audience so that we can draw inspiration from it for our own storytelling endeavors. So I am going to already drop on the chat, and I'm going to invite my team to please put on the chat the website page of YASDA. So the YASDA press page, I find that to be particularly impressive, with a lot of storytelling from survivors, from people, families that have been displaced. It's direct quotes. It is very powerful infographics and photos and interviews. And so there's also a lot of multimedia in that. That is something that I personally really look up to and am very inspired by. And so Abby, Maya, and Mohammed, when you have a quick moment, just drop on the chat also examples that you really like. And for anyone else who has a great example that you'd like to share with us, please definitely do so on the chat. I'd like to also, mindful of time, I want to just ask one more question, and noting that there are so many important questions that we're not getting to today. But a question from Nabil Zaidan. My question is, how are we able to expand our work? I'm going to take here that it's our communications work by joining forces with NGOs. So have you seen, Abby, Maya, and Mohammed, maybe Mohammed, I can pick on you here. Have you seen examples of good collaborations where sometimes it's not just an NGO that is telling a story, but a couple of people have come together and they've said, you know what, this is a cause. We would appreciate your thoughts on it. What do you think? Do you believe you're well placed to join us in telling this story effectively? Sorry, I know I'm putting you a bit on the spot, but I've seen you working with collaborative storytelling before.
No, definitely. And to be honest, there's a lot of stories that include similar collaborations. But the best example I would give is the example you gave at the beginning of the introduction is working on the Yazidi-led film. This is still genocide. It's an extremely impactful film, and that's a great example of how the media could actually collaborate with NGOs and other protagonists logistically and on the content side to tell stories and find, actually not only tell stories, but find new approaches and new angles to ongoing stories, ongoing struggles that have been all over the media. It's been covered all over the place, and it got international attention. I mean, local medias, international and regional medias have already covered the story, and yet we could formulate and find new angles, new ways to talk about the Yazidi genocide and I mean, bring it up to the public again from a new perspective.
Thanks so much for that. And my team is just going to drop on the chat a direct link to that documentary that shows that collaboration with Yazidi survivors, and as well a page where we brought in media and stakeholders and diplomats to be able to transform this documentary into a public cultural preservation asset for a community that is facing extermination in Sinjar and the broader region. final thoughts. I know that there are so many things that we could talk about in a couple of sentences. If you had to offer a final point of wisdom or a final point of inspiration to all our community-facing organizations who have dialed in today. Abby, over to you, and then Mohammed and Maya to close.
I would say just to be confident in yourself that the work you're doing is interesting and is important. I mean, if you think it's important for you to be doing it, other people probably will also think that it's important to know about it. But I think as we've talked about throughout this chat, you have to be a bit strategic about it and figure out where best to place those stories and which stories to try to push to the media and to which media. So I think that's probably the best takeaway.
Thank you so much. That's a very kind word of wisdom from Abby. Mohammed, over to you.
Yeah, definitely follow the news agenda, understand and know the best mean and the best outlet for your offer, and then be consistent. Do not feel frustrated about your stories not being picked up by one news outlet or another. Just be consistent about it and try to find a smart way in approaching the media outlets and the right media outlets.
Thank you so much for that practical advice. And Maya, to close us off.
Yeah, it's hard to be last after that because they basically summed it up. But yeah, I'll go back to that point that I said in the beginning. Really think about what you want out of media coverage. Is it more fundraising? Is it just more of a spotlight so people know what you're doing? Just really sit down and think about it. It's really, really worthwhile if you spend a little bit of time just trying to be really conscious and aware about what you're trying to get out of it. And with that very strong foundation, you'll be able to do really well with the other steps that follow.
Thank you so much, dear friends, Abby, Mohammed, and Maya. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for allowing us to take 10 extra minutes of your time. But a huge thank you to all of the organizations who dialed in today. We know you are the ones who are also very busy. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. We are looking forward to hosting you again soon. Good luck on all of the important work that you are doing. Please reach out to Abby, Mohammed, and Maya for any interesting perspectives, any potential noteworthy pieces and stories. Everyone in this Zoom room is a friend. So please consider the Friends of ZP and the ZP Public Office to be your resources as well. And wishing you all a wonderful, wonderful rest of the week. Ya'atikum elf afiyeh. And thank you to my team. And we can call this webinar to a close.